So I'm going to talk about tests your delivery pipeline might be missing, things you might not have considered. The goal of your delivery pipeline is to build confidence that what you have in your build is a viable candidate for production. So this talk is really going to be about how to improve that process by adding some extra types of tests to it to help you build that confidence. So you can't start everything right at the beginning and do it all up front. You can't push everything off to the end. So what you have to do is just enough of each type of testing at each stage to make sure that further testing is justified. So you want to do a little bit of performance testing up front, a little bit in the middle, a little bit at the end. You don't want to wait all to the end to do any of it. So one type of testing you can do is start looking at your dependencies. Make sure you're not carrying around extra code, extra dependencies that need to be checked. One possibility for this is if you're using Maven, you can go ahead and use some of the dependency check tools that make sure you're not including dependencies that you don't need. Poor quality code is a lot harder to maintain than good quality code. It's also harder to secure. So one suggestion is to use static analysis tools. Make sure you're checking your code, make sure there's not unused codes, unused variables, everything's as clean, you're going through best practices as much as possible, and also confine some of the simple security stuff to make sure you're using best practices. Make sure your libraries that you're carrying around are up to date. Use OWASP dependency check, works for a bunch of different types of languages, and really what it's doing, as Ben mentioned, is going through the National Vulnerability Database, looking for known CVEs against libraries that you're including. You also want to test your unit tests. It's not good enough to rely on code coverage, because code coverage tools typically only measure what code got run while your tests were running, not did you actually do any useful testing. So you can take those with an assert true at the end of every test. Mutation testing actually modifies your code to make sure that you actually catch the changes it makes. While you're doing your regular functional tests, you might want to consider doing some user role testing. That's like making sure that an admin can see this, a regular user can't. A logged-in user can see this screen, a non-logged-in user gets the login screen instead. And you can piggyback that on your regular functional test with Selenium. You can also piggyback on those functional tests by running it through a passive proxy, like OWASP. Right? As you're doing just your regular functional tests, if you proxy it through a security tool, you can be picking up on any cross-site scripting, SQL injection, cross-site request forgery possibilities, and just get some free security testing without taking an extra step of doing much. You want to make sure you have repeatable, reliable deployments, and you want to make sure that by the time you get to production and the deployment really matters, that you know that it's working because you've done it hundreds of times in every different environment all the way through to that. You also want to audit yourself. As you're doing these deploys, you want to audit the results so that you're not waiting until the end and an auditor actually comes in to make sure you're meeting your compliance. You can use something like Inspect from Chef to make sure that you actually are meeting your needs, keep all the ports closed they're supposed to, users closed that aren't, or users disabled that aren't supposed to do that. Also, check your base system that you're using. Something like OpenSCAP can be used to scan both your base image and then after you've deployed your code to make sure it still meets those best practices. And this is for ensuring things like the STIGs, the Secure Technical Implementation Guidelines. Simply keeping your packages up to date will help keep your code in good shape and more secure. Just running updates gives you, if you do it frequently, you get the incremental upgrades, you get the little point upgrades that are easier to deal with rather than waiting 6 months between upgrades. Also, consider subscribing to the US CERT weekly vulnerability summary just to see what security holes came out that week. Check performance all the way through, right? You don't need to wait for a full-blown load performance test at the end. You could just be looking at your build times, your test times from Jenkins. And you could be doing some small bits, 5-minute tests, just to make sure the trends are right, and you're not getting significantly slower. Also, especially with the web applications, don't just test the app. Make sure you're testing the database too. You can do all different types of testing with the app. You can do SQL map, you can do security testing, unit testing, analytics, and performance testing all in your database directly. Know what your users are doing. Get some analytics, monitor your logs, see what they're doing in production so that you can do the same types of testing in your pipeline to make sure you're covering the things they're hitting. You may have thought one thing is hardly ever used, it turns out it's used a lot. You may have thought something was used a lot, it turns out it's hardly ever used. Practice failure. If the first time you have to recover from a system outage is in production with people breathing down your neck, it's going to be tough. Even if you don't use something like Netflix's Singing Army or Chaos Monkey to bring it down, practice, do drills, make sure you're taking the system down as a regular occurrence, and bring it back up and you know how to recover. Scan all the systems. Don't forget about the infrastructure, your Jenkins server, your Nexus server, any other servers you have out there, your firewalls. Make sure they're all up to date. Make sure you're looking at your networks. There's no systems that just popped up. People just decide to throw something up on one of your secure networks. And remember that just because they're dev or test systems doesn't mean they're invulnerable to hackers. Hackers are not looking necessarily for production data. They just want a system in a lot of cases. So make sure you have regular protection against them. Things like AID is like tripwire for intrusion detection. Fail to ban just prevents brute force attacks. Remember that your pipeline is never going to be done. You're always going to be continually improving and adding a little bit more of this type of test because we found this type of test. Right? A little bit better is better. Do small incremental improvements, and you'll keep improving in your pipeline. And finally, don't forget to test your pipeline, because quickly you'll find that the pipeline itself becomes critical production code. And if the pipeline goes down because you're making changes, because you're experimenting with a new feature, or just because you're not paying attention to it, all of development is going to stop. You become reliant on the pipeline. You need to keep that up and running. You need to make sure you treat it like critical production code. Thank you.